Mr. Mayor, you were just mentioning a moment ago that it was fate that kept the house here. Was it? Was it really fate? I mean, some might say luck, but I think you've had an eye on this house for many, many years. And what do you see as its significance for San Jose?
Well, it's a real link with the past, just as the Peralta adobe across the street really reached back to really a distant time in history that's only a slight memory even to those of us that are interested in those latter days of history. The Peralta adobe, the Fallon House, and just one or two other buildings are really the only links we have either with the Spanish and Mexican period or the early California period. When you think about it, when this building was under construction in the mid-50s, Abraham Lincoln was an obscure former congressman in Illinois. Queen Victoria was a very young queen on the throne of England for only a dozen years or so. And you were only half a dozen years out of the Mexican rule period of California history. You only had a few thousand people in this small little pueblo of San Jose, but you had people that had hopes and visions and dreams like Captain Thomas Fallon, who was attempting to build a new life here and to raise a family. There is very little left of that period of time or the earlier Spanish and Mexican period. It was all obliterated in San Jose and I guess California's rush to the 21st century. We lost so many important things, and it's just particularly important that we have a building like this and that we have so many snippets of that history, the old family Bible and the Strawn box. And right in my hands here, as I showed you earlier, we have an old family photo of Captain Thomas Fallon's two daughters, probably 3, 4, 5 years of age, who died on his trip to New Orleans. So as you look around this particular home here, you know, there's so many little pieces, not only of a human being's history and a family's history, but of San Jose history. You know, he wasn't a dramatic figure on the California stage, but he was mayor of San Jose. He was an important figure in the early San Jose history and early California history. And he was really very successful as an agriculturist and as a municipal leader and as a businessman.
You were talking about the house being preserved. They were very lucky that it is, in fact, still intact mostly. How did it happen? How did it come to pass that occurred?
Well, there's a strong element of luck. Just as across the street I mentioned that an old man by the name of Mr. Baccio, who I knew quite well, has died since, preserved that Peralta adobe. He didn't know quite what it was, but he knew it had some significance and that someday it perhaps would be important in the city. Well, he was right, and just as this building somehow, even with the additions and with the remodelings and with the strange metamorphoses that have gone through the different neighborhoods that have surrounded this building, somehow this building has stood here. You know, it stood here from the mid-1850s until the dawn of the 21st century. Maybe it's more than luck, and I think I'd use the word fate a little bit more. There's a lot of lessons that can be drawn from this building. There's a lot of history that young people and maybe even people as old as us, Pete, can look at and get some meaning from.
One of the things that strikes me is that there is very little known about Thomas Fallon. But you do get a sense of who he was when you walk through his house, the house that he decided to build. It was a departure from what was then current style, a rather grand statement, even now, of the way one would choose to live.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you look around this home, you know, you look at the magnificence of it in a certain way, and you know that this is a man who did have dreams. You know, like many people, probably a good many of his dreams were never fulfilled, but that's kind of the essence of dreams. He was one of an immigrant from Ireland, just like the immigrants that have come from so many places to San Jose. He worked very hard, and he had a lot of things that he wanted to do, and really he was very successful in a number of areas. The pear trees he had right out in front over here, you know, produced $600 or $700 worth of fruit in one season in the late 1850s. That's a lot of money. He was successful in that field. He was successful, as I say, as a municipal figure. Some of the letters he wrote about municipal financing are really quite prescient, you know, quite a piece of work for someone who obviously was uneducated, but had picked up quite an education on the frontier and with the hard knocks you get as a pioneer. I mean, he came to California in 1844 with John Fremont. He crossed the Sierras in the winter, and he looked down on a paradise that people have been coming to ever since. And he was really the beginning of something, and although you probably would not see him ever in a California history book, the little pieces you can pick up from his letters. I particularly remember one letter where he's writing to an acquaintance of his after the death of his 3 young children. I mean, you see a real human being, and it's far different from some of the things that you read in the media, since he's got some latter-day attention. Yeah, some of the time they say it's better off to die young. I don't particularly subscribe to that school, but if you live to an age such as Fallon did, near 70, and you have a large family, and you attempt many things, obviously you're going to have your share of failures. You know, I think those who attempt and those who dream are definitely the type of people to look up to. You know, it's like Teddy Roosevelt's old man in the arena, the person who's down there and fighting and has all the setbacks. I mean, those are the people to admire. The people that don't make those type of attempts, that don't have any dreams, are really not really too much to look up to. You know, again, immigrants from all over the world have reached out for a better way of life. A lot of them have ended up in this valley. They're really the ones to admire. There's probably a lot of people, unlike Captain Thomas Fallon, in countries all over the world that accept the lot that they have for themselves and their family. I find the people more admirable who are willing to take a chance, and he took a lot of chances. You know, raising the flag a couple of blocks from here in front of the old Juzgado in 1846 may not have been one of the greatest of military ventures, but obviously his service in that and in the California Battalion with John Fremont, again, his old friend from the Overland Trek, were items, I think, of some significance. It's perhaps a little easier to diminish nowadays when we know there were no major battles fought in this area. But his work there, and his work, again, as an early pioneer, had to take some tremendous fortitude and courage, but that's what I see in most immigrants who come to San Jose.
This was his bedroom, I believe, the master bedroom. Fireplace here. I guess when the building was finished, he would have been what age?
He was 26 when he arrived in California in 1844, so he would have been in his late 30s.
When this house was built then?
Right, right. He would have been in his late 30s if my addition is correct. He was, as I say, a voyageur, which was a mountain man. That was his only occupation, and somehow he had picked up the trade of saddlery. You know, he had a small shop on an alley that ran right between San Pedro Street and Market Street. One of his addresses is there. And he was married into one of the original Spanish land grant families, the Castros. His wife, Martina Castro, was the heir to Soquel Rancho and Soquel Augmentation Rancho, which was 32,000 acres consisting of what we now know as Soquel and Capitola. Capitola, that nice little seaside community now that's gone through a lot of different ventures and gets flooded out about every 10 years, that was the Soquel Landing, which was the beach and pier and the basis for whatever type of cattle and other types of industries the rancho had. So he married into that family and had, again, 3 children who died on a trip to New Orleans. Obviously a tremendous, tremendous blow, enough of a blow probably to strike down most people. But he came back from that and started another family. A number of that family has lived down until this day. The great-grandson I was very good friends with, and he left a number of things to me that I then passed on to the Historical Museum, and someday I hope will be in this room and throughout the house, the Strawn box and personal letters, a play written by one of his daughters, Anita, who was an actress. There was an actress strain in the family. As a matter of fact, a grandniece of Captain Fallon's who lived over in Santa Cruz once told me that of all the family oral history that was passed down, he was a very flamboyant character. She actually thought he might have been an actor at one time, although I think she was just misled in that because he was so flamboyant. I mean, you could see him with that, with the French tickler, I think they're called, and you know, the hat. You could see him wearing a plumed hat. You know, kind of the cavalier character, and I think that was quite common for particularly Irish immigrants who came from nothing. Once they got into a situation where they had the ability to be successful, then they took on, I think, a bit of a cavalier air at some sides. You know, you see a lot of Irish officers in the American Civil War often had that kind of that swashbuckling attitude, the Irish brigades. So Fallon, again, I think fits very much into that mold, that type of an individual. I know Clyde Arbuckle tells a story of an old woman who gave Clyde this personal rendition of Fallon coming down San Pedro Street right out this window and doffing his cap, his hat in an elaborate bow to this woman. You ought to get Clyde to recite that. He'll tell it a lot better than I did. But you know, you just imagine what Captain Fallon saw out these windows. He saw the original, you know, Spanish-Mexican pueblo that used to be around here. The old acequia or ditch ran right through here. His neighbor would have been across the street, Luis Marie Peralta, one of the really significant people, the Comisionado of San Jose, an individual who really traced back to the original De Anza expedition. A block down the street would have been the Sisters of Notre Dame, whose grounds would have run from Santa Clara Street all the way back to the river. Over here you would have had the beginning of the commercial district. The Spanish-Mexican Plaza would have been kind of an oblong circle around here. St. James Park, where bear and bullfights went on. These were all things that were very common to Fallon. That's what he would have seen out the window. You know, he wouldn't have seen the St. John Club, and he wouldn't have been able to look down to the Gold Building, but he would have seen a city that had so many pieces of that past and that very interesting continuity that held it together for a significant amount of time. But of course that changed, and Fallon was a big part of the change. His involvement in trying to straighten out land titles in San Jose when he served his term as mayor. You know, although 110 years after his death, he's received a lot of notoriety, I would say, over this statue of raising the flag that was considered and will be put up a few blocks from here. But when he actually was alive, Fallon was extremely popular in the Mexican community. He was godparent to many of the prominent citizens' children, and his children had comadre and compadre. The godparents were some of the outstanding citizens in San Jose, the Picos and the Bernals. So although a century plus after his death, he seems to have become a little bit of an ogre because of his involvement in the Mexican-American War. He certainly wasn't when he was alive. As a matter of fact, many of those prominent citizens were extremely friendly with Captain Fallon and vice versa. I think history has perhaps been a little bit obscured by some of the modern day political needs of certain people.
He was in the prime of his life. He had to have been the most vital that he would ever be in his life. His late 30s, the most powerful he would ever be, perhaps?
I would say so. He was mayor in the early 60s, and obviously from his writings and things he's written about trying to settle the land title, he understood, and I think he was very focused, that without some kind of stability to the land titles in this valley, without an end to the divisiveness between the Mexicans and the new Americans, that San Jose would never prosper. You know, that, I think, it says a lot about Thomas Fallon, that he understood that stability and ending of that divisiveness was very important. I think it's a pretty good lesson. I think some people nowadays could probably learn a few lessons from that type of statesmanship. But he was at that period, as you say, a very strong, powerful person, someone who'd had an interesting past, and someone who obviously was seen as one of the major political leaders in this valley, one of the major municipal leaders, and someone who, because of his marriages into the Castro family, was really as well established as you could possibly be. If there could ever be a dynastic type of a marriage, it would be between someone like Captain Thomas Fallon, who represented the new wave of adventurers and entrepreneurs, I guess we could also use that 20th century word, who came into this valley, and the original settlers here as represented by the Castro family.
Yet that opportunity for a dynasty didn't come to pass. he left San Jose. His marriage dissolved, and his life went on elsewhere. And in fact, if he was at the height of his life in San Jose, living in this house, certainly he didn't end his life at that apogee, I guess, or apogee.
Yeah, you know, there's an old saying, and I don't know who it's from, but it's a rather interesting one. It says, "Judge no man happy until he's dead." You know, you do have a lot of reversals in life, particularly if you live for a long period of time, which we all hope to do, and if you attempt many things. You know, when you look at Fallon and his successes, he was married for well over 25 years. That's not a bad length of time for then, because of the many things that used to happen in those days, and just the mere mortality that you faced in that era. And certainly a pretty good standard by today. But yeah, he faced a lot of setbacks, not really financial setbacks, but the personal ones that obviously had to be much more difficult to accept. You know, as I said, how can you have more of a setback than having your 3 young children die? He was someone who seemed to move around really with an ability that you'd almost think he had frequent flyer miles. I mean, he used to just pick up and go to New Orleans. That's where his 3 children died. He did have some links to Texas. He traveled frequently in later life to Europe. He was one of the original capitalist, I guess, in the sense he had a lot of ideas. He wanted to turn that area above Capitola near New Brighton Beach into a resort. He owned that area. That's where his great-grandson lived until his death about a year and a half ago. Fallon actually, I believe, named that area New Brighton after a trip to Brighton, England, and saw it as a similar type of resort. So he was someone just packed full of different ideas, and obviously not a homebody. You know, he wanted to try different things, and like many people's life, you know, there was a lot of sorrow in it, a lot of sorrow, a lot of setbacks. But I think that's really a lot of human beings, and particularly those type of human beings who we know about as historical personages. You know, I mean, there's hundreds of stories out there of people who have many worse reversals and tragedies, but we know something about Fallon's, and they were significant.
Hey, how did you first come to, do you recall when you first knew that this was Fallon House and then were able to connect it to the past?
It would have been a bit of oral history from my father. You know, the fact that this was an area that, you know, I literally do know like the back of my hand. I mean, I can't even remember a time when I didn't know this was the Fallon House. You know, it was Manny's Cellar, and, you know, I used to go down there and have a bite to eat with my father, you know, many times when I was in high school and in college. It was a nice place, and we'd go down there and, you know, talk as you do over dinner about different characters, different people. There was always enough characters in the bar to keep your attention, but occasionally we'd talk about what this home was. You know, he remembered it well, but it was always a place that was in transition. You know, but all you had, I remember him taking me over to the front door, which would have been right in between the Warrito Cafe and just a place that was overgrown with a tree. If you remember that big tree that covered up the window and the door, you just look at the front of that and you'd see those large bay windows, and all of a sudden you'd see the Fallon House. You know, from the entranceway from the street as you go down Stairway to the Stars, as they used to call it, into the bar down there. Of course, I never touched any alcoholic spirits whatsoever down there, ever. But you have one view of the house. It's Manny's Cellar. It's a place where you get good food and interesting conversation. And then you just take a slight little walk around the side, and you look at the house a different way. And all of a sudden, it's the home of really one of San Jose's most interesting citizens, an adventurer, someone who traveled all over the world trying to find a new destiny. And that obviously is very appealing to anyone who's interested in history or human beings or motivation. And I don't really remember a time when I didn't know about the Fallon House.
Excuse me. If the Fallon House over the years had been put to other purposes and we had lost it, instead of it being preserve it in perhaps some haphazard fashion. But if it were not here, and if there were no opportunity to restore it, to rehabilitate it, what would San Jose have lost?
It would have lost its history. It would have lost its continuity with the remarkable people, men, women, families that built this community. It would have been a terrible loss, and, you know, frankly, I mean, we lost most of it. We've lost almost all of that except for a few structures, and I can count them all on one hand, like the Fallon House. So you can see school children coming in here after they've had a chance to look at the curriculum program that is going to be in all the schools, hopefully in the next couple of years, about our local history. 10 days about those individuals that did so much and ventured so much and risked so much and suffered significantly to build the community we have. They're going to be able to walk in here through these rooms and get a feel. They're going to be able to sit in his sitting room and walk through his bedroom and take a look at the pictures of his children and understand, perhaps through some of his letters, that this was a real human being. He wasn't a plaster saint. He was someone with a lot of flaws, just like all the human beings I know. But he was a significant character in San Jose history. And his family and his relationships and his friends were the people that laid the foundation for the successes that we've all had. So it's going to be a very important thing when this is open, a very significant thing that can't be underestimated. People will learn from this history. They won't learn some kind of antiseptic thing about Captain Thomas Fallon, the great cavalier. They'll learn about Thomas Fallon, the human being. And in that, I think they'll have a great deal of enjoyment.
Good.
Okay.
That was fun.